in the heart of Covent Garden, where the cobblestones are slick from centuries of London rain, where gas lamps once burned and horse-drawn carriages rattled past crowded taverns, stands a building that feels more like a relic than a theatre. It's the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. If you walk by today, you'll see its grand facade, the gilded accents, the polished glass doors. But the story of Drury Lane goes much deeper. This theatre isn't just old. It is ancient by stage standards. The very first version of the theatre opened its doors in 1663, more than 350 years ago. Think about that for a second. 1663. That was the same year Samuel Pepys was writing his famous diaries about London life. The Great Fire of London, the one that nearly destroyed the entire city, hadn't even happened yet. The United States didn't exist. People still believed in witch trials. And yet, in the middle of that world, this theatre stood. It became the place for entertainment. If you wanted to be somebody in London society, you went to Drury Lane. Nobles, politicians, merchants, even kings and queens, all walked through its doors. At a time when theatres were rowdy, dangerous places where fights broke out and the smell of cheap ale filled the air, Drury Lane stood apart. It wasn't just entertainment, it was an event. But almost as quickly as it was built, disaster struck. The original theatre burned to the ground in 1672, just 9 years after it opened. London was a city made of wood and open flames, and Drury Lane was no exception. But the theatre was so beloved, so iconic, that the city rebuilt it. Then, years later, when it collapsed, they rebuilt it again. When wars raged outside its doors, when riots shook the streets, when flames licked through London once more, Drury Lane survived. It became a kind of phoenix. Every time it fell, it rose again. And in its long history, it saw giants of the stage. Charles Dickens, the great author himself, sat in its seats. David Garrick, one of the most legendary actors in history, performed here in the 1700s. Joseph Grimaldi, the man who created the modern image of the clown, white face paint, exaggerated smile, red nose, performed here too, cementing himself as one of the theatre's most unforgettable figures. By the 19th century, Drury Lane was a cultural landmark. It had survived fires, rebuilding, and even a near financial collapse. It had seen Shakespeare performed in candlelight, operas sung before royalty, and riots where angry audiences literally hurled food, coins, and chairs onto the stage. And yet, for all its drama, scandal, and triumphs, the strangest thing about Drury Lane wasn't what happened on stage. It was what happened off stage. Because for over 200 years, people have whispered about what really lurks inside this theatre. Actors finishing rehearsals late at night, stagehands walking through empty wings, cleaners locking up at dawn. They've all reported the same chilling thing. That Drury Lane isn't just home to performers and audiences. It's also home to ghosts. And the most famous of all, the one that every single actor in London theatre has heard about, is a figure simply known as the Man in Grey. Every actor who's ever stepped foot on the stage at Drury Lane has heard the same story. It's almost like a rite of passage. Before you even learn the blocking of your scenes, or where the stage lights are hottest, someone, an older cast member, a stagehand, maybe even the director, will lean in, lower their voice, and tell you about him. They'll say, if you're lucky, you might see the Man in Grey. The description never changes. He's tall, dressed in the fashion of another world, another time. An 18th century gentleman, frozen in the style of the Georgian era. His face pale beneath a powdered wig, a tricorn hat tilted just so, casting a shadow across his expression, a long grey cloak draped over his shoulders like a shroud. And sometimes, if the light catches at the right angle, people swear they see the faint gleam of a sword strapped to his side. But the strangest thing? He doesn't appear when the theatre is alive. He doesn't materialize during the laughter, or the applause, or the roars of an opening night crowd. No. He comes when it's quiet, when the building is still. Actors and stagehands whisper that he loves the in-between hours, those fragile moments when the chandeliers are dimmed, the stage is bare, and the echo of footsteps hangs in the air. He'll appear in rehearsals, when only a few scattered performers are on stage, or in the long shadows of early morning, when the only sound is the creak of the old wooden floor. And when he does appear, he doesn't cause chaos. He doesn't scream or rush the stage. He doesn't even acknowledge the living. Instead, he simply watches. Stagehands say they've looked up during a lighting check and seen him sitting perfectly still in the balcony, his cloak pulled around him, as though he had purchased his seat long ago and never left. Others swear they've caught him in motion, moving slowly along the upper circle, the hem of his cloak swaying gently, before fading into thin air as though he were made of smoke. And unlike most ghost stories, the man in grey isn't feared. He's not seen as a warning or a curse. He's a welcome guest. Because over time, actors began to notice a pattern. Productions where the man in grey appeared during rehearsals seemed to thrive. Performances sold out. Reviews glowed. The show's run lasted longer than anyone expected. And so, the man in grey was no longer a shadow to dread. He became a symbol of good fortune. In fact, it grew into a kind of superstition. Entire casts have claimed to see him together. Imagine it, you're rehearsing a complicated scene, the stage lights blazing down, when suddenly someone at the back gasps. The cast stops, the crew turn, and there, sitting in the gloom, silent and still, is the unmistakable figure of the man in grey. Not one or two people seeing him. Dozens, all at once. Enough witnesses to silence the skeptics. And yet, for centuries, the mystery remained. Who was he? Why Drury Lane? Why did he walk these corridors and no others? He never spoke. He never revealed his name. He never moved beyond his quiet patrol of seats and balconies. He was simply there, a cloaked phantom woven into the very fabric of the theatre. For many, that was enough. The theatre world loves its myths, its superstitions, its stories whispered in green rooms. And so the man in grey remained just that, an unsolved mystery, a ghostly mascot of the theatre. But then, in the 1840s, everything changed. Drury Lane was undergoing one of its many renovations. Carpenters and labourers filled the building, tearing down old plaster, replacing wood beams, hammering, sawing, pulling apart sections of the centuries-old structure. And one day, behind a crumbling wall deep inside the theatre, the workers made a discovery. At first it seemed like nothing, just debris, dust, a hollow space that shouldn't have been there. But as they cleared it away, something took shape, a shape that froze them in place. Because staring back at them from inside the wall were bones. Human bones. The skeletal remains of a man, long concealed, sitting slumped in a hidden cavity. And if that weren't terrifying enough, there was one more detail. The skeleton wasn't bare. Draped across the decayed frame were fragments of clothing, the tattered remains of an 18th century cloak. A cloak that was grey. The discovery shook everyone who worked at Drury Lane. Londoners were fascinated by the tale of a skeleton walled up inside the theatre. But for those who actually performed on its stage, the revelation was unsettling in a way that's hard to describe. Because suddenly, all those stories about the man in grey, the tricorn hat, the cloak, the wig, the sword, weren't just harmless folklore. They were tethered to something physical, a body, a crime scene, a real man, murdered and hidden away in the very place where actors now laughed, rehearsed, and lived out their dreams. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, the timing of his appearances grew even stranger. Actors swore that he was drawn to moments of anticipation, not when the theatre was bustling and alive, but in the liminal spaces, the quiet hour before a show began, or the eerie calm after the curtain had dropped and the crowd spilled into the street. Stagehands finishing their late-night clean-up would pause and feel that unmistakable sensation, that someone was watching from the balcony above. One account, passed down from actor to actor, described a rehearsal in the early 1900s. The cast was running lines under dim stage lights when suddenly the room fell silent. Every eye turned toward the same spot, the upper circle, where a tall figure in grey sat perfectly still, hands folded, face shadowed by his hat. Dozens of people saw him at once, and just as calmly as he had arrived, the figure stood, walked a few steps, and vanished into the wall. Another tale came from a dresser who was walking the empty corridors behind the stage. She rounded a corner and saw a man in a grey cloak moving ahead of her, slow and deliberate, the sound of his boots echoing against the wooden floor. But when she followed him around the bend, there was nothing, only silence. These weren't isolated whispers. In fact, the man in grey became such an ingrained part of Drury Lane that he was expected. New performers were told not to be afraid if they saw him. Quite the opposite. If the man in grey appeared during rehearsals, it was said to mean the show would be a triumph, and history seemed to back that up. Productions with confirmed sightings often went on to become long-running successes. The ghost had become, in a bizarre way, almost like a good luck charm, a guardian of the theatre. But the skeleton in the wall made it impossible to ignore the darker side of the story. Who had he been? Why was he killed? Some historians believe he may have been connected to the turbulent decades of the early 1700s, when duels of honour were common in London. Rivalry, jealousy, or betrayal could easily end in a sword fight. If a man of status had been slain inside the theatre, it would explain why his body was hidden rather than buried with dignity, conceal the crime, erase the scandal, and let the theatre continue without a shadow of disgrace. Others think the story is closer to Shakespeare than to history, a tale of forbidden romance. Perhaps the skeleton was that of a man who had fallen for the wrong woman, or discovered a secret he was never meant to know. A dagger through the ribs, a hurried cover-up, a cloak left to rot as the bricks closed around him. And then there is the most chilling theory of all, that the man in grey is not simply the ghost of the man in the wall. Because if that were true, if his remains had been discovered and given air again, shouldn't his spirit have found peace? Shouldn't the sightings have ended? But they didn't. In fact, after the 1840s discovery, reports increased. It was as if unsealing the skeleton only gave the presence more energy. Some paranormal researchers suggest the man in grey is not a traditional ghost, but what's called a stone tape haunting, an echo of an event so traumatic that it imprinted itself onto the very fabric of the theatre. Not a spirit with consciousness, but a playback of terror, replayed again and again across the centuries. Yet actors who have seen him insist he feels intelligent, purposeful. He chooses when to appear, he observes, he lingers, and when he vanishes, it feels deliberate. To this day, if you step into the Royal Theatre, Drury Lane, you might be told the same thing actors have heard for centuries. If you're lucky, you'll see the man in grey. And if you do, remember, he is not there to harm you. He is there to watch, to bear silent witness, as he has done for more than 200 years. But the question still hangs in the rafters of that grand old theatre, like a line that never quite delivers its ending. Is the man in grey truly the murdered soul bricked into the wall? Or is he something else entirely, a shadow that belongs not to the past, but to Drury Lane itself? The man in grey isn't the only one haunting Drury Lane. For centuries, the theatre has collected ghost stories the way other places collect dust. Some are fleeting, shadows out of the corner of the eye, a voice in the rafters, but others are persistent, seen again and again by people who had no reason to invent them. One of the most terrifying is known only as the woman in black. Unlike the man in grey, who seems calm, detached, even strangely benevolent, the woman in black has a reputation for unease. Her presence is heavier, colder, charged with a kind of sorrow that sets nerves on edge. She's said to move silently up and down the staircases, her footsteps soft and deliberate. Actors rushing between scenes sometimes freeze, swearing they feel someone brush against their arm, even though the corridor is empty. Others, distracted while applying makeup, have looked up at the dressing room mirror only to see her there standing directly behind them. Always dressed in black, always watching, always gone the second they turn around. One stagehand from the 1920s described an incident during a late-night strike. He was dismantling scenery when he heard the click of heels behind him. Assuming it was one of the chorus girls returning for a forgotten bag, he turned to offer help. But what he saw froze him. A woman in a long black gown was ascending the side staircase, gliding smoothly, her head slightly bowed. The sound of her footsteps was crisp, echoing through the empty theatre. But halfway up the stairs, she simply vanished. And she's not alone. Some guards working overnight patrols swear the theatre itself comes alive after dark. Doors open and close without a hand to push them. Curtains ripple when the air is still. The temperature shifts so suddenly that breath fogs in the empty auditorium. And then, there is the sound. Several guards, separated by decades, have described it the same way. Applause. Not a polite smattering, not a couple of drunks clapping outside, but the roar of a full audience, cheering, stamping, the thunder of hands coming together in celebration of a play that isn't happening. Imagine it, you're alone in one of the grandest theatres in London, the gas lamps extinguished, the stage silent, and then you hear it, an invisible ovation, filling the balconies, the stalls, the royal boxes. Thousands of unseen hands clapping in the dark. Some believe this is not one ghost, but hundreds. That the theatre, layered with centuries of triumphs and tragedies, has become a kind of sponge, soaking up the energy of every audience that ever roared to its feet. And at night, when the house is dark, the sound leaks back out. But not all the spirits are content to merely watch or applaud. There are stories of Charles Macklin, an actor from the 18th century, who infamously killed a fellow performer backstage during an argument. In a fit of rage over a missing wig, Macklin reportedly drove his cane through the man's eye, killing him instantly. Though Macklin himself went on to live a long life, it's said that his guilty spirit lingers at Drury Lane. Witnesses describe hearing the sharp, impatient tap of a cane on the floorboards, or catching the glimpse of an elderly man muttering in the dressing room corridors. And then there is Joseph Grimaldi, the famous clown of the early 19th century. Grimaldi revolutionized pantomime, becoming one of Britain's most beloved comic performers. But his personal life was racked with suffering, illness, loss, and depression. After his death, actors claimed his ghost returned to the theatre. Unlike the woman in black, Grimaldi's presence wasn't menacing. Instead, he was said to appear beside nervous young actors, encouraging them, even helping them find their marks on stage. More than one trembling performer has reported being gently pushed into the spotlight at just the right moment, as if guided by invisible hands. Between the man in grey, the woman in black, Macklin, Grimaldi, and the phantom audiences, Drury Lane has earned a reputation as not just a haunted theatre, but perhaps the most haunted theatre in the world. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Think about what a theatre is. It's a place built on emotion. Every night, it hosts laughter, tears, rage, passion. Actors pour out their souls, audiences respond with thunderous energy, and the building itself soaks it all in. Night after night, year after year, century after century, Drury Lane has been standing in one form or another for over 350 years. How could a place like that not be haunted? Even skeptics, people who scoff at ghosts, admit there's something uncanny about the building. Tourists on daytime tours report feeling watched from the upper boxes. Electricians doing maintenance hear voices whispering their names. And actors, some of the most practical, skeptical people you'll ever meet, admit privately that they believe. One famous performer, after encountering the man in grey during a rehearsal, put it best: "You don't come to Drury Lane to chase ghosts. They come to you." And to this day, if you visit the theatre, the guides will tell you the same thing. Watch the staircases, glance at the mirrors, listen carefully when the house falls silent, because if you're patient, if you're lucky, or unlucky, you may just find yourself in the company of Drury Lane's ghosts. The man in grey, the woman in black, the restless cane of Charles Macklin, the helping hand of Joseph Grimaldi, and the applause of audiences long gone. All of them waiting in the dark. All of them still here. Today, the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane is still alive. Lavish productions run nightly. The chandeliers still glitter, and thousands of people sit where Dickens, kings, and queens once Saturday. But beneath the velvet and gold, the ghosts remain. Actors still whisper about the man in grey. Stagehands still feel the icy chill in the corridors. And every so often, during rehearsals, a figure in a grey cloak is spotted watching quietly from the balcony, never speaking, never moving, just present. And when that happens, everyone backstage smiles, because they know the legend. If the man in grey is there, the show will be a success. The Theatre Royal, Drury Lane isn't just one of the oldest theatres in London. It's also one of the most haunted, a place where history never left, where the dead still watch, and where the curtain never truly falls, because on that stage, the audience is eternal. In the late 1800s, London's West End was a world of its own. In the heart of the city, theatres rose like palaces of light against the night sky. Inside, the velvet curtains, chandeliers, and booming applause created a kind of magic that pulled people in night after night. And one of the crown jewels of the West End was the Adelphi Theatre. The Adelphi was elegant, prestigious, and always full. It wasn't just a stage, it was the stage. To perform here was to be among the elite. If you were a star at the Adelphi, you weren't just known in London, you were celebrated across the country, written about in newspapers, followed in the streets, adored by fans who waited by the stage door just to catch a glimpse of you leaving after a performance. And in the 1880s and 90s, one man ruled that stage. His name was William Terriss. Now, if you've never heard that name before, you should know this. Back then, Terriss wasn't just an actor, he was the actor. Imagine the charisma of a modern Hollywood leading man mixed with the heroic stage presence of someone larger than life. That was Terriss. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and classically handsome. On stage, he had a voice that could command silence from the back row without ever seeming strained. When he entered a scene, people leaned forward. He didn't just play heroes, he was the hero. Noble soldiers, brave adventurers, gallant gentlemen, Terriss embodied them all. Audiences didn't just applaud him, they idolized him. But perhaps even more remarkable was that the man behind the curtain matched the roles he played. Offstage, Terriss's reputation was just as golden. Unlike many celebrities who let fame curdle into arrogance, Terriss was known for his kindness. He mentored younger actors, sometimes slipping a few coins into their hands when he knew they were struggling, other times pulling strings to get them auditions. He was the type of man who stayed late at the theatre to run lines with nervous newcomers. To many in the acting world, he wasn't just a star, he was a lifeline. Terriss had it all: the adoration of audiences, the respect of his peers, a career that only seemed to rise higher each year. He was the leading man everyone wanted to see and the colleague everyone wanted to work with. But where there's light, there's always shadow. And in Terriss's case, that shadow took the form of another actor, a man named Richard Prince. Richard Archer Prince was, in many ways, the opposite of Terriss. He was shorter, slighter, and far less commanding on stage. He had once shown promise, appearing in supporting roles at the Adelphi. But while Terriss's star rose higher with every passing year, Prince's career faltered. His roles became smaller, the applause quieter. Eventually, the work dried up almost completely. By the late 1890s, Prince was bitter, unemployed, and struggling with his mental health. He lived in poverty, relying on the goodwill of others. And here's where the story takes a dark turn, because one of the few people who had shown him kindness was William Terriss. Terriss, true to form, had tried to help Prince. He had given him money. He had tried to find him work. He had even arranged for him to receive help through the Actors' Benevolent Fund, a charity for struggling performers. But in Prince's mind, these acts of generosity twisted into something else. Instead of seeing Terriss as a savior, he began to see him as an enemy. His pride was wounded. To accept Terriss as help felt like an admission of failure. Every coin pressed into his hand was another reminder that he had fallen, while Terriss had risen. And so, slowly, resentment festered. To the outside world, William Terriss was still the heroic figure adored by audiences and admired by colleagues. But to Richard Prince, he was something different. He was the reason for his failures, the symbol of everything he couldn't be. Terriss may have been beloved, generous, and noble, but in Prince's eyes, he was the villain. And Prince was about to strike back. His name was Richard Archer Prince, a struggling actor whose story had once run parallel to William Terriss's. Years earlier, the two men had shared the same stage. They had rehearsed in the same cramped dressing rooms, powdered their faces under the same flickering gas lamps, and bowed to the same applause. In those days, there was no rivalry, just two working actors trying to make their way in London's crowded theatre world. For Prince, it even seemed promising. He had talent, or at least enough of it to earn steady roles. He had presence, enough to be noticed. For a fleeting moment, it looked like he might carve out a respectable career of his own. But while William Terriss's star shot upward, role after role, audience after audience, Prince's trajectory bent the other way. At first, the decline was subtle. A missed role here, a smaller part there. Directors began to favor fresher talent, while Prince was shuffled further down the cast lists. Then the offers slowed to a trickle, and soon, they stopped altogether. Audiences filled the Adelphi to see Terriss, the dashing hero, the noble soldier, the gallant gentleman. His name alone could sell out a performance. But Prince? He became forgettable. His performances were unremarkable. His reputation unimpressive. His name rarely appeared on playbills anymore. And in the brutal world of London theatre, being forgotten was worse than being hated. By the mid-1890s, Prince was broke. He drifted from cheap lodgings to dingy pubs, often borrowing money, often drunk, often muttering about how the world had wronged him. To friends, what few he had left, he seemed unstable. His temper was unpredictable. He carried himself like a man who believed he had been robbed of something that should have been his. And here's where things took a dark turn. He became obsessed. The more his own life collapsed, the more he fixated on Terriss. At first, it was simple envy, the bitter pangs of seeing someone else live the life you wanted. But envy is like rust, leave it unchecked, and it eats away at everything. Soon it twisted into something darker. Prince began telling himself a story. In his mind, Terriss wasn't just lucky. He wasn't just talented. No, Terriss was the reason for his failures. Prince convinced himself that Terriss had sabotaged him, whispered in the ears of managers, pulled strings with producers, turned the entire industry against him. There was no evidence of this. In fact, all signs pointed the other way. Terriss was famously generous with younger actors, even slipping them money when they were desperate. But Prince didn't see generosity. He saw conspiracy. And that's the terrifying thing about delusion. Once it takes root, it doesn't need to be real to control you. By the late 1890s, Prince's obsession had curdled into pure hatred. He muttered about Terriss in taverns, warning anyone who would listen that the great actor's time was running out. He was seen loitering near theatres, staring at posters with Terriss's face on them, grinding his teeth as if each smiling image mocked him personally. Those around him grew uneasy. Some wrote him off as pathetic. Others, quietly, wondered if he might be dangerous. And then, on December 16, 1897, Richard Archer Prince decided he was done waiting. That night, the Strand was alive with movement. Gas lamps burned like halos above the wet pavement. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, their wheels throwing up sprays of dirty water. The winter wind cut sharp down the street, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke and the faint sound of laughter spilling out from pubs. Among the crowd of Londoners hustling through the cold, one man walked with purpose. His coat was buttoned high against his throat. His hands were buried in his pockets, and hidden in the folds of that coat was a knife. Prince wasn't coming to the Adelphi Theatre to see a play. He wasn't coming for the lights, the music, or the applause. He was coming for William Terriss, and this time, he wasn't leaving until Terriss was gone. That evening, William Terriss walked briskly down the Strand toward the stage door of the Adelphi Theatre, a path he had taken countless times before. The gas lamps glowed faintly in the damp December air, their light cutting halos into the winter fog. Terriss's figure was unmistakable, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy coat against the cold. Despite the chill, he carried himself with his usual energy, nodding to acquaintances as he passed, his boots clapping firmly against the wet pavement. For Terriss, this was routine. He had been on that stage hundreds of times. The Adelphi wasn't just a workplace, it was a second home. Behind that door were his fellow actors, his dressing room, his familiar scripts. To him, the theatre represented warmth, applause, belonging. He approached the side entrance where he always went in, the stage door tucked into a narrow lane. Inside, the doorman recognized him immediately, just as he always did. Terriss gave a polite greeting, a half smile, ready to step inside and prepare for rehearsal. But before he could, a figure detached itself from the shadows. It was Richard Archer Prince. In the dim glow of the gaslight, his face looked gaunt, wild-eyed. He had been waiting, motionless, silent, building himself up for this exact moment. As Terriss stepped forward, Prince suddenly blocked his path. There were no words, no confrontation, no warning. In one swift motion, Prince pulled a knife from beneath his coat and drove it straight into Terriss's chest. The actor gasped, his body jolting backward in shock. For a second, he didn't even register what had happened. He staggered, one hand instinctively grabbing at the wound, his mouth falling open as though he were about to protest, to ask why. But before he could speak, Prince struck again, and again. The blade rose and fell in a frenzy, glinting briefly in the lamplight before disappearing into Terriss's body. The attack was ferocious, fueled not by reason but by years of pent-up rage, delusion, and obsession. Terriss staggered back toward the stage door, his strength draining with every blow. Witnesses nearby would later say the scene seemed surreal, like a performance, except this time there was no stage, no script, no applause. Just violence. The doorman shouted for help. Actors inside heard the commotion, but it all happened too fast. Within moments, William Terriss, the dashing hero who had been cheered night after night by London audiences, collapsed onto the cold pavement just steps away from the theatre he loved. His lifeblood seeped into the stones as the December air bit cold against his skin. He was only 50 years old, and just like that, the man who had been one of the West End's brightest stars was gone, killed not on stage, but at its very doorstep. The murder stunned London. The next morning, every newspaper headline screamed the same words: William Terriss murdered outside the Adelphi. His name was splashed across the city in bold black ink. At newsstands, crowds gathered shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks to glimpse the pages. People gasped, shook their heads, and murmured to each other in disbelief. Their golden boy of the stage, their dashing hero, had been cut down, not in some grand duel, not in a tragic accident, but in cold blood, on the dirty pavement just steps from the theatre door. To Londoners, William Terriss wasn't just another actor. He was the actor. He was theatre royalty. To lose him was unthinkable. To lose him so violently, it was a wound to the entire West End. Richard Archer Prince, meanwhile, was arrested almost immediately. Police officers who searched him found he was still carrying the knife, stained with Terriss's blood. He offered no remorse, no apology. only bitter mutterings about how Terriss had ruined him. When dragged into court, he sat silent, staring with blank eyes, while his defense lawyers argued that he was mad. The courts moved quickly. Prince was declared insane and shipped away to Broadmoor Asylum, where he would live out the remainder of his life, forgotten and alone. But William Terriss's story didn't end there, because in the months following his death, strange things began to stir inside the Adelphi Theatre. At first, they were subtle, the kinds of things people dismiss as imagination. A stagehand sweeping the corridors late at night suddenly froze, his broom mid-air, as an icy gust swept past him. The corridor was sealed tight, no open windows, no doors ajar, yet the chill was sharp enough to raise goosebumps through his coat. He swore it felt like someone had brushed right against him. Then an actress, rehearsing alone on the stage, heard it too. Footsteps, slow, steady, pacing in the wings. She called out, thinking perhaps another actor had arrived early, but the sound didn't answer. It just stopped. When she peered into the shadows, the wings were empty. These stories spread among the company, whispered in hushed voices over tea or between acts. Some laughed them off, calling it stage nerves. But then came the sightings. They were too specific, too consistent. One by one, performers began reporting the same thing, a tall figure in Victorian dress lingering near the stage door. Always the stage door, always the very spot where William Terriss had been stabbed. Some said he stood still, just watching silently. Others described him drifting slowly through the hallway, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. A few even claimed he would vanish mid-step, dissolving into the gloom as though he had never been there at all. What unsettled people most wasn't the figure's appearance. It was his expression. Those who saw him swore he didn't look angry or frightening. He looked sad. And then the whispers began. Multiple performers swore they heard a voice in the empty theatre. A low, gentle whisper drifting from the shadows. Not menacing, not cruel, but soft, encouraging, almost like someone urging them on. Actors described it in detail, a voice that seemed to come only in moments of stress, just before a high-stakes performance, just as nerves threatened to overwhelm them. And in that instant, when panic swelled in their chest, the voice came, calm, steady, reassuring, as if telling them, "You've got this." Several actors even swore that when they were seconds from forgetting a line, or freezing under the stage lights, they felt a hand, light as air, press against their back. Not shoving, not dragging, but nudging, helping. It was as if William Terriss, in death, was still doing what he had always done in life, lifting up those around him. As the decades passed, the stories didn't fade. They multiplied. New generations of performers, many of whom had never even heard the story of Terriss's murder, described the same sensations. The sudden chill, the shadow at the stage door, the gentle whisper urging them on. In the 1920s, a chorus girl fainted during rehearsal. When she came to, she told her fellow actors she had seen a tall man in a frock coat and top hat watching her from the side stage. When they pointed out that no such man had been in the building, she burst into tears. In the 1950s, a night watchman reported seeing a man step through the stage door, then vanish before his very eyes. Shaken, he refused to work the night shift again. And even in the modern era, some actors at the Adelphi claim to feel Terriss's presence, a sudden cold draft sweeping the stage just before the curtain rises, a whisper when the house is silent, the unmistakable sense of being watched, not in a threatening way, but in the way of a mentor making sure you're doing your best. Today, the Adelphi Theatre still stands proudly on the Strand, its lights glowing against the London night. It is one of the most glamorous theatres in the West End, but to those who know its history, it is also one of its most haunted, because while Richard Archer Prince's name has been lost to history, William Terriss has never really left. Every so often, when the house lights dim and the curtain rises, actors say you can feel him there, watching, encouraging, applauding, not as a ghost of vengeance, but as a ghost of the stage. And for those who believe the story, that final act, supporting his fellow actors from beyond the grave, might just be the greatest role William Terriss ever played. Over the years, sightings spread beyond the theatre. Down the road, in Covent Garden Underground Station, staff told stories of a ghostly man in evening dress drifting silently through the tunnels. Many believed it was Terriss, restless, still bound to the neighborhood he had once walked every night. Today, the Adelphi Theatre is famous for musicals, laughter, and standing ovations. But behind the curtains, in the dim corridors near the stage door, some believe the story hasn't ended, because the theatre still belongs, just a little bit, to William Terriss, the leading man whose final curtain never fell. In the heart of London's West End stands the Lyceum Theatre, an ornate giant that has been entertaining audiences for centuries. It first opened its doors in 1765, designed to impress with its grand facade, sweeping staircases, and a stage that promised magic the moment the curtain rose. Over the years, it became one of the city's most iconic stages, a place where history and artistry intertwined. The theatre itself was more than just a performance space. Its architecture reflected ambition and elegance, gilded moldings that caught the glow of gas lamps, balconies carved with intricate designs, and a ceiling painted with allegorical figures that seemed to watch the audience as much as the performers. The velvet curtains, deep crimson in color, absorbed sound in a way that made even the smallest whisper carry across the auditorium, adding an intimacy and tension to each performance. Even the floorboards creaked with an almost musical cadence, responding to the footsteps of actors and stagehands alike. Everyone from Charles Dickens to Bram Stoker walked through its doors. Dickens, known to visit theatres frequently, would sit quietly in the shadows, observing performances and the subtle interactions of actors behind the curtain. Stoker, on the other hand, had a more official role. He worked as a business manager in the 1890s, overseeing the theatre's finances, coordinating shows, and ensuring that the performances ran without incident. But for Stoker, the Lyceum was more than a workplace. It was a repository of stories waiting to be discovered. The long, shadowed corridors, echoing footsteps late at night, and hushed murmurs of performers became the invisible threads woven into the suspense, horror, and dark romance that would later populate Dracula. During Stoker's tenure, the theatre was led by Sir Henry Irving, a towering figure in Victorian theatre. Irving's performances were legendary, drawing audiences who would line the streets to witness the grandeur of his productions. Under his guidance, the Lyceum transformed into a theatrical powerhouse, with productions that pushed the limits of imagination. Stage sets were no longer mere backdrops. They were elaborate worlds of their own, complete with hidden trapdoors, intricate mechanical effects, and lighting that could transform a scene from the warmth of a summer afternoon to the chilling shadows of a moonlit night in an instant. Audiences marveled at the spectacle, unaware of the strange occurrences whispered about behind the scenes. Even in the midst of artistic triumph, the theatre held secrets. Staff and performers often reported fleeting shadows where no one stood, doors that opened and closed on their own, and the faintest whisper of a voice in the empty auditorium. Many assumed it was simply the imagination running wild in a place steeped with drama and emotion, but the frequency and consistency of these occurrences suggested something else. Stoker, navigating the labyrinthine hallways, backstage rooms, and hidden staircases, became intimately familiar with the theatre's hidden corners. There were dressing rooms where the air turned inexplicably cold, corridors where the footsteps of an unseen presence echoed back in perfect timing, and narrow passageways where a chill would run down one's spine even in the warmth of summer. Some historians argue that these sensations, coupled with the theatre's charged atmosphere of ambition, desire, and tension, shaped the suspense and palpable sense of dread that would later define Dracula. But beyond the architecture and the stories of famous figures, the Lyceum carried something deeper, a memory of its past, lingering in the shadows. Strange events became a part of daily life for the staff, props shifted overnight, faint shapes appeared in peripheral vision, and at times, a sudden silence would fall over the theatre as if it were holding its breath. Some performers spoke of a presence watching from the upper balconies, while others felt a cold, almost tangible energy brushing past them backstage. It was as if the theatre itself was alive, aware, and unwilling to let the past rest. Even the decorative elements seemed to play a role in the theatre's mysterious aura. The gilded carvings, ornate cornices, and painted ceiling figures often caught light in unusual ways, creating illusions of movement. Stage mirrors, intended to enhance depth, sometimes reflected figures that weren't really there. Velvet drapes would shift slightly when no breeze existed, and chandeliers would sway imperceptibly in rooms without ventilation. Each of these small, almost imperceptible details added to the feeling that the Lyceum was not just a place of performance, but a vessel of history, memory, and something far less explainable. The theatre's reputation for mystery grew over time, fueled by decades of anecdotal accounts. Stagehands would exchange stories in quiet corners, a figure glimpsed in the darkness, a cold draft that followed them up the stairs, a whisper too soft to catch but too precise to ignore. Actors would hesitate when passing certain doors, feeling a presence that wasn't part of the rehearsal. Even the audience, seated in the shadows of the upper balconies, sometimes reported a prickle of unease, a sense that the theatre was aware of them, watching silently from above. By the end of the 19th century, the Lyceum was no longer just a theatre, it was a legend in its own right. Its history was layered with the lives of those who performed, the brilliance of its productions, and the inexplicable events that seemed to thread through every corner of the building. For Bram Stoker, it was a crucible of creativity, inspiration, and perhaps a brush with something beyond the ordinary, a quiet reminder that the boundaries between life and legend were often thinner than anyone realized. Even today, the Lyceum carries that same aura. While modern renovations have updated its facilities, the air still seems charged with whispers of its past. Performers and staff report fleeting glimpses, the feeling of being watched, and the faint sensation that some stories, like those of Bram Stoker and Sir Henry Irving, are never truly finished. The Lyceum Theatre stands as a monument to history, artistry, and mystery, a place where every shadow might conceal a secret and every echo could be a message from the past. Staff members from the late 1800s often spoke in hushed tones about inexplicable events at the Lyceum Theatre. At first, these incidents were small. Doors that had been bolted shut would creak open on their own. A simple stage prop would appear in a different location than it had been placed. In a building as vast and intricate as the Lyceum, such occurrences were easy to dismiss, until they became routine. Stagehands began noticing patterns. Footsteps echoed through empty corridors late at night, soft and deliberate, as if someone were pacing, observing them. Curtains would sway slightly despite no draft, and stage lights would flicker unexpectedly, plunging sections of the auditorium into darkness before illuminating again. Objects moved subtly, a chair nudged forward, a prop sword shifted a few inches, or a stack of scripts found in a different pile than where it had been carefully arranged. Some of the older crew swore the theatre itself was alive, reacting to unseen energy, almost as if it remembered every rehearsal, every performance, and every life that had passed through its halls. Then came the first credible sighting. A young stagehand, familiar with every creak and echo of the Lyceum, reported seeing a woman gliding across the upper balcony late one evening. Her gown was long and flowing, a misty grey that seemed to merge with the shadows, and her face was hidden beneath a veil. He ran toward her, shouting, but when he reached the balcony, it was empty. Nobody had entered. Nobody had left. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. He would later describe the sensation as a weight pressing against his chest, as if the room itself were holding him in place. The story spread quickly, and the staff began calling her the Grey Lady. Unlike the usual ghost stories whispered backstage, this was a figure that seemed to return night after night. She became a fixture, her presence almost expected, though never predictable. Over the years, countless others reported encounters. One actor rehearsing a monologue alone backstage felt a chill brush past his neck, followed by the unmistakable sensation of breath against his ear. He turned quickly, expecting a fellow performer, but found only an empty hallway. Another stagehand, carrying heavy crates of scenery up the back stairs, suddenly felt a hand rest on his shoulder, icy and insistent. He spun around. No one was there. The hand, the chill, and the sense of being watched were enough to make him drop the crates and flee. Performers who worked late into the night spoke of glimpses in the auditorium, shapes shifting in the upper circles, fleeting shadows that vanished when looked at directly. A singer preparing for a recital once noticed a figure in grey sitting in the far corner of the stage, as if waiting for her to begin. When she blinked, the figure had disappeared, leaving behind only the faintest scent of perfume. Another actor swore he saw her standing at the foot of the stage, silently observing, then dissolving into nothingness when he approached. Even the youngest stagehands, often skeptical of such stories, began to feel the presence. Cold drafts seemed to follow them through the narrow corridors, and the soft echo of footsteps sometimes mirrored their own movement with a delay that was impossible to explain. Some nights, the theatre would fall silent, so completely that even a cough seemed amplified, and in that silence, a whisper would echo, just beyond comprehension, as if the Lyceum itself were speaking. Despite decades of sightings, the Grey Lady's origin remained a mystery. Some believed she was an actress who had died tragically in the theatre's early years, perhaps betrayed by fate or love. Others speculated she was connected to Bram Stoker, a ghostly muse who inspired his chilling tales. Regardless of the truth, her presence was undeniable. Staff and performers alike accepted her as part of the theatre's ecosystem, a constant observer, silent but potent, watching over rehearsals, performances, and the shadows in between. Even in the daylight, the Lyceum seemed to retain her memory. Stagehands reported strange reflections in mirrors where no one stood, and actors sometimes felt eyes on them when they thought they were alone. The building itself appeared to remember the Grey Lady, her energy woven into the very walls, the floorboards, and the velvet seats. To work at the Lyceum was to live with the sense that history was present, tangible, and sometimes restless. By the turn of the century, the Grey Lady had become legend. She was no longer merely a story told in whispers, she was part of the Lyceum's identity. Even those who had never seen her spoke of her as if she were real, cautioning new staff to respect the theatre and the spirits that lingered within. She was a reminder that the line between performance and reality, between life and the shadows of the past, was thinner than anyone dared imagine. Sightings of the Grey Lady were not confined to the upper balconies, though that is where she was most often first noticed. Over time, reports began to surface of her appearing in the most unexpected corners of the theatre, drifting silently along the main staircases, gliding down corridors lined with dressing rooms, or even standing at the very edge of the stage, just out of the spotlight, watching rehearsals unfold. There were accounts of her suddenly materializing inches away from a stagehand or actor, only to vanish when approached. Those who saw her described a figure that seemed both solid and ethereal, a woman trapped somewhere between life and death, her movements deliberate yet hauntingly silent. She carried an air of melancholy that was almost tangible. It was not malevolent, but heavy, as if she were searching for something she could never find. Performers often spoke of a subtle tension that accompanied her presence, the kind of tension that made your stomach knot, your skin prickle, and your mind aware of a watcher whose gaze could not be avoided. Some felt that she wandered the theatre endlessly, trapped in a loop of unfinished business, her spirit tethered to the events and emotions that had once filled the Lyceum. Her appearances were often accompanied by strange, sensory phenomena. A sudden chill would sweep across the stage or corridors, sharp enough to make one shiver despite the warmth of a summer evening. The echo of footsteps would resonate in hallways where no one was walking, perfectly timed to the rhythm of a performer's movements, yet originating from an unknown source. And then there was the perfume, a faint, floral scent, delicate and fleeting, that hung in the air in places where no living person had passed. Some performers swore it was lavender, others claimed it was rose. The inconsistency only added to the mystery, but all agreed that it was unmistakably human in origin. Speculation about her identity was endless. Some believed she had once been a young actress, perhaps someone whose talent had been admired but whose life was cut tragically short. Others suggested she could have been a member of the stage crew, a performer who never saw her final curtain call, and whose spirit had chosen the Lyceum as a permanent home. There were even whispers linking her directly to Bram Stoker, a spectral muse who observed the theatre's life and death, inspiring the dark, melancholic tones that would later define his writing. To some, she was a guardian. To others, a warning that the line between life and the afterlife was perilously thin. Accounts from the early 20th century only deepened the lore. One actor, rehearsing a dramatic scene late at night, felt an icy pressure at his back as if someone were breathing down his neck. When he turned, he caught a glimpse of grey moving past the stage lights, and for a brief moment, he swore he saw her face, a pale visage framed by a veil, hollow yet sorrowful eyes meeting his before she vanished. On another occasion, a stagehand moving scenery through the theatre's labyrinthine backstage passages saw her gliding down a narrow stairwell. He froze, unable to breathe, and watched as she disappeared through a wall of shadow, leaving behind only the faint scent of perfume. Even the seasoned staff, those who had spent decades in the theatre, reported feeling her presence. They described cold spots that followed them through hallways, an inexplicable heaviness in the air that made movement sluggish, and an awareness of being watched even when alone. One custodian, sweeping after a late performance, claimed that the Grey Lady had appeared at the top of the grand staircase, silently observing him with her head tilted slightly, as if in recognition of his efforts to maintain the theatre. He said the sensation of her eyes on him lasted long after she had vanished, a lingering pressure that made him work faster, almost out of fear of disappointing her. There were also moments that seemed almost deliberate, as if she were interacting with the living rather than merely haunting the theatre. Props would occasionally shift in ways that aligned perfectly with the drama of a scene, a chair placed just so, a curtain gently swaying at the climax of a monologue, a shadow falling over the stage exactly where tension demanded. Many began to speculate that she was not merely a passive observer but had a connection to the theatre itself, influencing events in subtle, inexplicable ways. Some accounts bordered on the supernatural in a way that made even skeptical performers uneasy. Actors preparing for late-night rehearsals reported hearing whispering, soft, almost indecipherable words that seemed to respond to their own thoughts. Others claimed that in quiet moments, when the theatre was empty and still, the faint sound of movement could be heard above them, like someone pacing, yet when they investigated, there was no one there. These phenomena, while never directly threatening, carried with them a weight of history, of grief, and of longing, as though the Grey Lady's spirit had been imprinted into every corner of the Lyceum. Speculation about her origins never stopped. Was she a tragic figure, an actress whose life ended too soon, a muse for Stoker's imagination, inspiring shadows and chills that would fill Dracula? Or was she something more ancient, a lingering echo of all the human emotion the Lyceum had ever contained, love, ambition, jealousy, sorrow, and pride? Whatever the truth, her presence was undeniable. Even today, performers speak of her in a tone that balances respect with fear. She is no longer simply a story told in whispers, she is part of the theatre's fabric. Modern actors working under bright stage lights still feel sudden chills, faint sense of perfume, or the subtle sensation of being watched from the wings. Backstage, the creaking floorboards and shifting curtains continue to suggest a presence beyond explanation. The Grey Lady is not malevolent, at least, she does not strike in anger, but she is insistent, a constant reminder that the Lyceum is more than brick, timber, and velvet. It is a living memory, a vessel of history, and for those who have glimpsed her, a place where the line between life and legend is nearly invisible. She is not just a ghost, she is a sentinel, silently wandering staircases, drifting through corridors, and appearing at the edges of the stage, watching, waiting, and never truly gone. Not all encounters at the Lyceum were gentle. Some left performers and staff shaken for weeks, even months. A young actor, preparing for a performance late one evening, felt a sudden, icy hand rest on his shoulder. Startled, he spun around, expecting a fellow cast member playing a prank, but the space behind him was empty. The chill lingered, crawling across his skin like frost, and the sensation of unseen eyes on him was so intense that he refused to step onto the stage that night. Word of the incident spread quickly, and soon others admitted to feeling similar touches, brief brushes against skin, sudden chills that seemed to move with them, or the inexplicable impression that someone was standing just behind them, watching, yet invisible. The phenomenon was not limited to actors. One cleaning lady, working late after everyone else had gone, reported hearing soft, sorrowful sobbing echoing through the auditorium. Initially, she thought it came from a distant part of the city, perhaps the wind carrying sounds through open windows. But the sobbing persisted, steady and melodic, almost rhythmic, leading her to the front row of seats. There, she claimed to see a woman in grey, seated quietly, as if observing a performance that wasn't happening. The figure lifted her face, revealing hollow eyes filled with sadness, before slowly dissolving into the darkness. Terrified, the cleaner fled immediately, never returning to work after dark. Other reports were equally chilling. A stagehand moving scenery during a late-night rehearsal described hearing rapid, deliberate footsteps following him through the empty corridors. Expecting a colleague to emerge from a doorway, he turned, and found nothing but shadows. A sense of being followed lingered, pressing on him as he moved. Similarly, a soprano practicing alone backstage swore she heard someone whisper her name, soft, insistent, and almost coaxing. She turned, flashlight in hand, but the hallway was empty, the echo of her own heartbeat the only sound accompanying her steps. Even veteran performers, those accustomed to the creaks, groans, and peculiar acoustics of a centuries-old theatre, found themselves unnerved. During one intense performance, an actor described a cold breeze sweeping across the stage just as his character reached a climactic emotional peak. The velvet curtains fluttered slightly, though no draft existed. The stage lights dimmed and flickered in perfect rhythm with the tension of the scene, creating shadows that seemed to dance independently. Another performer described seeing a grey silhouette appear at the top of the grand staircase, standing motionless for a heartbeat before gliding out of sight. The pattern of these occurrences suggested that the Grey Lady was drawn to moments of heightened emotional intensity. Many performers began to suspect that she had an inexplicable connection to the drama itself, responding to grief, tension, and passion present in the theatre. Some believed she appeared during moments of vulnerability, silently reminding those present that the Lyceum was more than just a building, it was a space where the energy and emotions of generations of performers had left an imprint. Sensory details accompanied almost every sighting. Witnesses described heavy air, a sensation like pressure on the chest, or sudden drops in temperature that felt almost physical. Some reported hearing faint footsteps behind them on silent corridors, only to find no one present. The scent of perfume, a soft, floral aroma, was a recurring hallmark, lingering inexplicably in empty hallways or around stage areas, often fading just as suddenly as it appeared. Even technical staff, who usually worked in the shadows behind the curtain, experienced unusual occurrences. Lighting technicians reported lights dimming, flickering, or shifting angles without command, often coinciding with emotionally charged moments on stage. Props would move slightly, chairs nudged forward or back, and curtains shifted as though a hand had guided them. None of these events caused damage, but they left enough uncertainty to make staff question whether what they were seeing and feeling was truly explainable. Some incidents had a psychological weight. A stage manager recounted returning to the theatre early one morning to check equipment. As she crossed the stage, she felt as though someone was walking behind her. She described the feeling as of a presence weighing on my shoulders, as if the theatre itself were aware of my movements. Upon turning, no one was there. On another occasion, an actor rehearsing a scene late into the night felt cold air rush past him, followed by the soft brushing of fabric against his arm. When he looked, the corridor was empty, yet he was left with the impression of someone observing his performance. The Grey Lady was never aggressive, but she commanded attention. Her presence carried a subtle authority, a reminder that the theatre's history was alive and present. Actors reported moments where the floorboards seemed to creak in rhythm with their movements, curtains shifted slightly in response to the tension in a scene, and even echoes appeared timed with their own dialogue, almost as though the building itself were participating in the performance. Over decades, these experiences cemented the Lyceum's reputation as a theatre of grandeur interwoven with ghostly intrigue. The Grey Lady became more than a whispered legend. She became a living presence, woven into the very identity of the theatre. Staff learned to respect her, sometimes hesitating to enter certain corridors alone or moving cautiously during late-night rehearsals. Performers and stagehands developed an almost instinctive awareness of her presence, acknowledging that certain parts of the theatre were not meant for the living alone. Visitors too felt her presence. Even modern audiences, seated in the shadows of the upper balconies, occasionally reported a prickle of unease, a sensation of being watched. Some described lights seeming dimmer than usual in certain seats, or hearing faint noises that did not come from the stage. Those who spent hours within the Lyceum, whether performing, maintaining, or rehearsing, came to understand that the Grey Lady was not a threat in a conventional sense. She was a reminder. The past, when lived with intensity, never fully disappears. She represented the convergence of human emotion, theatre, and history, where the line between performance and reality blurs in ways that even the most rational mind struggle to explain. Even today, performers report feeling the same chills, witnessing subtle movements of props, or sensing a presence behind the wings. Technical crews occasionally encounter inexplicable flickers of stage lights or faint sounds echoing across empty corridors. The Grey Lady remains woven into the Lyceum's identity, a silent guardian, observer, an echo of the countless lives that passed through its halls. Her presence is a bridge between past and present, reminding all who enter that some stories, once written in human emotion and lived experience, never truly end. They linger, palpable, in the spaces they once occupied. Even today, the Grey Lady's presence at the Lyceum Theatre is far from a relic of the past. Though the theatre has undergone renovations, and modern lighting and sound systems now dominate its stage, the stories persist, unchanged in their eerie consistency. Technicians, performers, and staff continue to report moments that defy explanation, moments where the theatre seems alive in ways that no technology or logic can fully account for. Modern actors describe rehearsing for major productions and suddenly feeling the unmistakable sensation of being watched, even when the auditorium is empty. A lead actor preparing for a musical recalled feeling a cold presence brush past him as he delivered a monologue in an empty theatre, followed by a subtle whisper that seemed almost familiar, yet just out of comprehension. Stagehands have reported spotting fleeting grey shapes moving across the upper balconies, figures that vanish if approached, leaving only a faint scent of perfume and a lingering chill. It isn't just the performers who feel her. Technicians have recounted lights dimming or flickering at pivotal moments in rehearsals, seemingly responding to the emotions playing out on stage. Microphones have picked up faint sounds that could not be traced, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, soft rustlings in the wings, or the creak of floorboards in rooms where no one is present. Even props, carefully arranged by stagehands, sometimes appear subtly out of place the next day, as though guided by invisible hands. Visitors and audience members, too, have occasionally sensed her presence. Those seated in the upper balconies or shadowed corners of the theatre sometimes report an unexplainable awareness of being observed. A long-running production once noted that performers would feel sudden chills or experience unexplained goosebumps, particularly during emotionally intense scenes. While subtle, these occurrences serve as a reminder that the theatre's history is never truly absent. It lingers, quietly shaping the atmosphere. Many who have spent significant time at the Lyceum describe a sense of intimacy with its past. Some performers have recounted standing alone in the wings and hearing the faintest whispers of applause, or seeing shadows that seem to mimic movements from decades ago. Stagehands who have worked late into the night often speak of the feeling of invisible footsteps trailing them, sometimes stopping at a distance, as if observing, waiting, or acknowledging their presence. Despite the unsettling nature of these encounters, the Grey Lady is not viewed as malicious. She does not strike, threaten, or interfere directly with performances. Instead, she is a persistent, silent observer, a reminder that the Lyceum is more than timber, brick, and velvet. It is a vessel for memory, emotion, and history. Her presence is both a warning and a comfort, a bridge between the theatre's storied past and its present, a lingering trace of the countless lives and performances that have passed through its halls. Some performers interpret her appearances almost poetically, as a guardian of the theatre's artistry, keeping watch over those who carry forward the tradition of performance. Others sense a melancholy in her presence, a reminder of unfulfilled lives or ambitions, of talent cut short, or stories left incomplete. Staff have even noted that certain corners of the theatre seem more charged than others, the upper balconies where she is most often seen, the narrow corridors behind the stage, and the staircases connecting the labyrinth of backstage rooms. These are spaces where her presence is strongest, almost tangible, and where the boundary between past and present feels thinnest. Historians and enthusiasts alike have tried to trace her origins, but the truth remains elusive. Some speculate she is connected to the theatre's earliest days, a performer who died young, or a figure linked to the era when Bram Stoker walked its halls. Others argue she is simply the accumulation of centuries of human emotion, lingering in a place that has always been alive with passion, ambition, and intensity. Regardless of her origin, her presence is undeniable, documented repeatedly by those who have worked, performed, or simply passed through the Lyceum. Even as new productions fill the theatre with light, sound, and the energy of modern audiences, the Grey Lady continues her silent vigil. She is seen and sensed in moments both quiet and dramatic, a reminder that the theatre's past is never gone, that every creak, shadow, and chill might be a message from someone, or something, that never left. For those who have witnessed her presence, the Grey Lady has become more than a story. She is a living legend, a silent companion through rehearsals, performances, and the empty corridors that carry the weight of centuries. The Lyceum Theatre remains a beacon of art and history, but for anyone who has truly felt her presence, it is also a place where the line between performance and afterlife blurs, where history steps out of the shadows to watch, guide, and never quite let go. Because the Grey Lady never bought a ticket. She never left, and when the lights dim and the audience falls silent, many swear she is still there, gliding through the darkened aisles, lingering in the wings, and watching over a theatre that has long been her home.